microphone back on again. Tony, you should have permission to put on your microphone and camera now.
Yep, I've got the microphone and I've got the camera on.
Perfect. Okay. There we go.
I was just going into my phone to make sure that the do not disturb is on the phone.
Yeah, that's the most embarrassing thing. One reason people might be struggling, I just noticed that Flash have pushed out an update today. So if you're relying on Flash, the old Flash will cause problems with the room. That's typical of Blackboard, I'm afraid. I just got a notification down below. Okay, so without further ado, fingers crossed that everybody can hear properly, I'll hand over to Tony Prince, who's going to take us through today's webinar. Over to you, Tony.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. So I'm hoping that the sound is quite good. I checked with Sean earlier. If at any time you have any issues with the speed I'm talking at, with the volume, please just put it in the chat. Christina, thank you very much. For those who are on mobile phones, I'm hoping that the dulcet sounds of my voice are going to be good enough for you. Rather than being able to see me, you will, if you're on a mobile phone, you will have the benefit of not seeing the light in this room bouncing off my shiny bald head. So there are some benefits to just being on a mobile phone. Okay, so as you can see, hopefully from this slide, what we're going to be looking at today is the framework for communicative speaking. And the purpose of me putting this picture in is not just for beauty, for aesthetic reasons, but also to indicate what I'm trying to do as part of this, this webinar. That I'm trying to provide a framework which can help students and teachers to relax about the process of encouraging communication in speaking, such that the teachers are relaxed about what activities the students are doing, and the students are relaxed about what is expected of them, where they are going, how they are doing these things, right? So the emphasis in this webinar is very much on practical application of speaking. Right? So what I'm going to be emphasizing is how to use this in class, how to design activities quite quickly, but within a principled framework. Right? So just to indicate to you my background. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that you have a picture of a lake and a building beyond that. That's the University of East Anglia, UEA. It's in Norfolk in the United Kingdom. Norfolk is about 2 hours by train from London. It's a rural part of the country. The university is actually one of the top 20 in the country, and I worked there for about 15, 16 years, predominantly on what are called pre-sessional and in-sessional courses. So pre-sessional is preparing students for university study, and in-sessional is when they're actually at the university. And that was where I began to become more interested in frameworks for developing communication and frameworks for developing language skills. And one of the main reasons for that was because what I found was that very often students were able to talk, students were able to interact, but students were not necessarily able to do all the aspects of communication that were expected of them. So for instance, they would be able to describe something, they would be able to explain something, but they weren't necessarily able to analyze or to evaluate or to synthesize information from different sources. And much of the research that I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years has emphasized the increasing need for these kinds of skills, these kinds of communicative skills, where you are not just telling somebody something, but you're integrating what they have said and you're responding to what they have said, building on it. taking account of their point of view, evaluating it, providing support for your own point of view, and doing this kind of critical thinking. So when I talk about communicative speaking, I mean speaking that has a particular function, speaking that operates in a framework inside a process to help students to communicate more functionally, more specifically, rather than just communicating in general. Okay, so when I moved over to NILE, which is the Norwich Institute for Language Education, about 2 years ago, I was focusing much more on teacher training and on helping teachers to respond to the needs of their context, helping teachers to develop skills. And one of the main skills that I encountered that teachers need was helping students to develop critical thinking. And so this framework is part of that. It's looking at communication inside of a framework for helping students to think and to demonstrate their thinking in terms of using functional language. Okay, so that's my background. Now, for me, there are two main problems in getting students to speak, and this comes back to the blog post that I sent to Oxford, and Oxford has put up as an introduction to this talk. One of the main problems that I see in getting students to speak and getting students to communicate is the differences between students. That we nowadays have a wide variety of language levels, a wide variety of language skills in a class. We have different personalities, we have different motivations, we have different points of view from students doing a similar skill. So students might be trying to improve their speaking, but they are doing it from very different starting points, very different personalities, often, very different kinds of skills, perhaps because of their culture, perhaps because of their family backgrounds, perhaps because of their aspirations. They have different, they come to speaking tasks with different aspects, with different strengths and weaknesses. Okay? The other problem that I see is that students very often cannot see how they can develop their speaking or their skills in a systematic way. Often speaking is a skill that is a bit fragmented, perhaps, and language is a subject that is fragmented or sporadic within the teaching syllabus. So you might, for instance, have a situation where you are teaching students once a week for 2 hours, or maybe 3 or 4 times a week for 2 hours each, or 1 hour each, but only one of those sessions is focused on speaking. And the issue with this is that then students struggle to see how one lesson is related to another and how these lessons build on each other to help them to develop their skills. So again, this framework is trying to help teachers in that, in demonstrating how language builds, how communication skills build. Right? So just to reiterate, we're going to be looking at the differences, how we respond to student differences, and how we respond to student difficulties by providing a framework that helps them to see the structure and the development of those skills, both in terms of their ability to communicate at higher levels and their ability to think at those higher levels. Okay? So it's not too ambitious. So we're not trying to solve all of your problems, but we're just trying to make things easier in terms of structuring communicative skills. Okay? So this is a chance for me to take a sip of my coffee, because I've now been talking for about 10 minutes, and a chance for you to reflect. So what I'd like you to indicate is, when you see this picture, it's an indication of me wanting your feedback. what I would like feedback on this time is for you to indicate what kind of problems do you have in helping students or developing students' speaking abilities, right? I've numbered these, so you can put a number in the chat box, or you can put an indication of which of these areas. Is it language, is it skills, is it personality, or is it something else? So you now have about 30 seconds to a minute to put your answers in the chat box while I have a sip of coffee. Okay, so we've got 2 5s. We've got willpower, 2 5s at the moment. 2 people talking about 3 5s. 2 people talking about language. Personality also shows up. More personality, willpower, more language. Okay, low self-esteem. That's very interesting. Very interesting. So language is coming up quite often. So is motivation. Okay. So language, motivation. Okay, somebody's put Elizabeth has put 5, 4, 6, 1, 2, 3. Okay, well that's interesting because it's nicely ordered. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Okay, a combination of the 6. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Okay, so those people that are talking about motivation, what I would say is that if we can provide a framework that shows students how they can develop, then motivation increases. Very often what I find is that students lack motivation when they're not clear where they're going, how they're developing. And they're not clear why what they're doing is relevant to what they need to do in everyday life or what they will need to do in their future studies or their future employment, right? And so one of the reasons that I am situating this in a framework is to help teachers to be able to demonstrate, today we're doing this, it's linked to what we did last week, it's also linked to what we will do next week or next lesson. It's building your skills, right? And that, I believe, is helping them to become more motivated. What we also have is a framework that provides different levels so that the students can build their language, but we're not expecting them to suddenly jump to a higher language level, okay? So I'm hoping that this is going to answer many of the questions or many of the problems that you're raising. But please, as I go through, if you have an issue, if you have a problem, please raise it in the chat box. I'll also give you time as we go through to pose those problems. So what I'm saying is that we are providing students with a choice from items in our framework, and that choice comes as part of a system, right? That it's not just random choice, it's choice from a number of different options. And that sometimes it might be appropriate for the teacher to make those choices or to limit those choices because they're saying this is what the student needs to do. Sometimes it might be appropriate for the teacher to open those choices up and to say, we are allowing you to choose from 2 or 3 things, but we're limiting it to those 3 things because those are what you need to do, okay? So, choice, but within a system. Okay, so the system is taken from Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy was first proposed back in 1956, so it's very old, but what's interesting is that it's becoming increasingly common that it is referred to within national syllabuses, within ministries, that it's almost as if it's taken 60 years for it to be more widely accepted and for it to become more common as a part of a syllabus, as a part of a national curriculum. Right? So Bloom's taxonomy has a number of different levels. Right? It's approaching the demand of education and structuring it to say that there are lower level demands and higher level demands, or lower level thinking skills and higher level thinking skills. Okay, so at the lowest level, Bloom, or more recently Cradwell and Anderson and Cradwell, talk about knowledge, and knowledge is where you are getting students to indicate what they know, yeah? To indicate what they remember, what they recall, and often it's simple things like listing or telling, or giving the name of something, for instance. Right? Then at the next level up, we have comprehension, which is where we're getting the student to show that they understand something. Right? So at the level of knowledge, we might say, list all the pieces of furniture you would find in a kitchen. Right? Now, a student might recall 5, 10 items. That doesn't mean that they know the meaning of all of those items. It just means they recall that those items are something to do with kitchen. But at the next level, at the comprehension level, we're asking them to do something which shows they recognize or they know the meaning of those items. They know what they are. So for instance, we might ask them to explain or to illustrate with an example what something is, right? So what is the difference between a chair and a table, for example, okay? At the next level up, we have apply or application, which is where we're getting students to use that knowledge in particular ways, right? These are known as the lower order thinking skills, and they're often presented as on this slide, in a hierarchy of like a pyramid. But more often nowadays, they're presented in a circle or in a way that suggests that they can be cross-connected, so that you don't necessarily have to go from knowledge to comprehension to application, but you can go from knowledge to application. Right? Or in the higher order, you could go from knowledge to evaluation, right? Because it's across a circle. It's not that you have to go through each of these steps to get to the top, but you can go from one step to another. Okay, and I'll demonstrate this as we go through. So analysis, let me just take this back. Analysis is where we are breaking things down, where we are looking at things in more detail. Synthesis is where we are combining things, bringing things together. Might be compare and contrast, might be indicate how things connect, right? Link things together. And then at the top we have evaluation, right? Which is indicating how things are important, or judging whether one thing is better than another, or whether it is more suitable for a particular context. Okay, so what I've provided here on this next slide is just a brief description of what those things are. As we go through this talk, or as I go through this talk, what I'm going to be doing is showing you how this applies to speaking. Right? But it's important, first of all, just to understand that this is the framework we're working within. As I said, one of the reasons that I've chosen this framework is because it applies to critical thinking. And critical thinking is a buzzword that's being used a lot with educational authorities, ministries, foundations, many different areas, because what they're emphasizing is that as society becomes more technological, as we increase the level of tasks that computers can do, for instance, or that can be moved to countries where it's maybe cheaper for these things to be done, so the people in the country who remain in work, or who are able to find good jobs, are doing these higher order skills, these analysis, synthesis, evaluation. And if you want the better jobs, if you want the jobs that are going to be more long-lasting, you have to have the higher order skills as well as the lower order skills in all areas of language, in speaking, in listening, in reading, in writing, all areas. Right? But today we're going to be talking about how this applies to speaking. But it's a good idea to keep this in mind in terms of general education. Okay, so my next question is, in terms of your students, what problems do they have in terms of their own learning or their own activities? Is it that they have problems with understanding or using the information you give them comprehending or applying? Or is it that they have more problems with the analysis, synthesis, evaluation? So again, you have about 30 seconds just to indicate to me which ones. Thank you, Alexandra. So we have 3 application, 4 to 6, 3, 4, 3, 5. Okay, 2. That's interesting. So comprehension. So we had some people who were looking at the lower order thinking skills. Okay, so that's interesting. It's interesting that we've got a mix between some people who've got a situation where they are focusing on the lower order aspects of this, and some people where it's the higher order, and some people where it's the middle. What I would guess is that this is often dependent on the requirements of the educational context, where some educations might focus more on getting students to recall, to understand, to be able to use that information, and that's what's required in the tests, that's what's required in the activities that they do. And other contexts might be focusing more on requiring students to do those higher level skills, right? So yeah, so as Katerina says, it's maybe not so applicable within the educational context to focus on 4, 5, and 6, right? But what I would emphasize is that it's important for students to know that at some stage they will be expected, more than likely, to be able to analyze, synthesize, evaluate, right? And so it's very useful to situate what you're doing in terms of a bigger framework, a bigger context. Okay, so so what I'm talking about here is being able to adjust the settings in terms of what we are requiring in terms of language, what we are requiring in terms of critical thinking, and just thinking in general. That we want to be able to change the demand, to change the difficulty. And as teachers, we want to be able to do that quickly, easily, flexibly, right? So what we're looking at here is a system that allows us to change the settings in terms of thinking and in terms of communication, okay? So to give you an example of this, right? So this is where we become, we start to look at it more practically, okay? So Elizabeth just put up a comment about different areas that the Bloom talks about. I'm principally focusing at this moment on the practical application of this. There's a whole lot more that you can look at in terms of how you're assessing this, how students are growing, in, as she says, in terms of their emotional well-being, their emotional IQ, certainly. But I'm limiting this, as somebody was saying earlier on, to how this can apply in the classroom in terms of being able to develop activities quite quickly, change them, change the demand, okay? And as Sean has said, I will leave more than enough time at the end for people to ask questions about how this might relate to other aspects of Bloom's taxonomy, okay? So in terms of knowledge, what I would say is that we have a number of verbs that we can use to represent activities that require students to do this lower order thinking, which is recalling something and simply putting it down on paper or saying it, right? So the blue activities, or the blue verbs that I will be giving in each case, indicate those kinds of activities that a student can do on their own, right? Then I'm providing, with each of these levels, brown activities that might be more common for students to do in pairs, and then this light brown or mustard colored activities that indicate things that students might do in groups. Okay, so in the blue group is asking students to tell us what they remember, right? To list or to define or to identify something, right? Then we might ask them to select from those items and retell another student, or we might ask another student to select from what you have chosen and then retell. Okay, so let's take an example. Right? Let's make this practical, even more practical. So this is the Common European Framework topics and areas of vocabulary for the levels A1, A2, B2. Right? Sorry, B1. I've limited it to that because I want to focus on the lower levels of students for the moment. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken from this the topic of holidays, and I'm going to be talking about this throughout as the example. Okay, so in terms of knowledge, what we might ask students to do is to list the places they have visited on holiday. Right? This is one thing, and that just asks them to recall the names of places. Just what names, what places, could be a city, could be a country, could be a town, could be an area, anything they can recall. Right? Then we ask them to arrange those places into good and bad holidays. Right? So just go list and then arrange them. Then we ask them to identify what made the holidays good and what made the holidays bad. Right? So if they have 5 places that they visited, we might say 2 of them are good, 3 of them are bad. Right? In terms of the good holidays, what was good about them? Was it good because of sun? Was it good because of hotel? Was it good because of food? What? Right? Then we ask them to define a good holiday. Right? So for instance, my example, 2 of the places that I've really enjoyed going on holiday recently are Cornwall in the UK, which I would strongly recommend going to. Right? Cornwall, down the bottom of the UK, beautiful place, sun, sea, nature, quiet, beautiful. Right? The other place that I've been to that I've really enjoyed is Lisbon. I went there for a conference about 3 weeks ago. Loved it. What's noticeable about Lisbon in relation to Cornwall is that it's sun, it's next to the sea or the river, because I was told that although I thought it was the sea, Lisbon is actually on a river, but right? So I could then define it as a good holiday for me would be sun and next to the river, right? Elizabeth, yeah, what we're doing is we're grading the task, but we're grading the task based on a framework that's already been proposed and already had extensive research in relation to that, and that's Bloom's grading. So we're grading it in terms of the demand, the cognitive demand, and what we're relating that to also is the language demand. Right? So here is the functional language that we might ask students to use in doing those activities. So we might say to students, for instance, that they could list the things without using any language to begin with. They could identify the features without saying anything. They just do it by themselves. Define for themselves what is good, but then we might propose to them that they start to communicate, to use these phrases, to use this language that is related to the activities that they have done. So what they are then doing is they're using functional language, they're using phrases rather than just word by word by word. They're using phrases to introduce a particular kind of function, a particular kind of communication that they're doing. Right? Now, what I would emphasize here is that, just let me get back, what I would emphasize here is that we can select as many verbs, as many activities as we want from one level to suit the students. Right? So on this slide, I've presented 8 verbs, right? at what I would call three levels or three types, right? Individual, pair, group. But there are many more verbs that you can find and that I could recommend to you in terms of people who looked at this in terms of what kinds of demands are asked of each of these kinds of verbs, right? And so you could have more verbs that you might choose from. The reason that I have limited this is because what I want to try and provide students with is vocabulary that they would use, or sorry, not vocabulary, but phrases that they would use related to those functions. Because one of the things that I have found in my own teaching is that students very often struggle because they don't have a way in to the communication. They are thinking in terms of the grammar and the vocabulary, and they're not giving themselves an easy way into starting the communication. And one of the reasons that I love teaching functional language would be that it provides students with a support to begin the conversation, to begin the process of speaking, right? So you are scaffolding, or you're supporting that that communication. Okay, so the language, the functional language, is supporting them, but it's also asking them to look at communication in a different way. The communication is not just about building word by word, not about building correct grammatical structures, but about using signals or using chunks of language that are related to functions, that are related to particular kinds of communication. And what I have found is that when we ask students to look at language in a different way, right, in this way, then you are helping students to relax more about the vocabulary, or about, sorry, the building of the phrases of the communication, and to enter into that communication more easily. Yeah. So it's in response to what people are saying about a prompt. You could call it a prompt, or you could call it a structure that supports their communication and asks them to look at communication in a different way. That it's not simply saying something that's accurate, or it's not simply saying something. It's saying something that has a particular kind of function. Right? Now, again, to go back to the context that I was in previously, the issue that I very often had was that students were able to talk on a topic, they were able to describe things, able to explain things, but when it came to using that information, to using that language to respond to what others were saying, or to evaluate what others were saying in light of what they had said, they were confused, they were struggling. And so what I'm trying to do is to position the language, the functions, in terms of each other. Okay? So we're looking at each one of these levels. Just let me take you back to this picture. We're looking at each one of these levels and looking at how we can get students to do activities that are related to these levels, and how we can build across levels, across types of thinking and types of communication. Okay? And we're using functional language to help them to develop those speaking skills, develop those thinking skills, to build across lessons, to build across activities, to build their communication. Okay? All right. So time for me to take another sip of coffee and for you to answer to what extent do you think this would be useful in helping students to build their communication? Right? And I'll come back to the question that Elizabeth has asked in a minute. Okay, so if you could just indicate whether this would be useful, not. Adriana's put a smiley face. If you want to put a sad face, if you want to say what problems. Okay. So coming back to, thank you very much for your comments. So coming back to the problem, the point that Elizabeth was coming up to about translation. What I would recommend is that you look at the work of Philip Kerr. Kerr is K-E-R-R. He's written a book recently, in the last couple of years, about the use of translation and translation methods. And he's got a website called, I think it's called translationhandouts.com. And I'll just put that in the chat. Translation handouts. I'm pretty sure it's translationhandouts.com. Yeah. And that is related to his work in a book that he produced for Cambridge, sorry, another publisher, in a book that he produced, which is talking about how translation can work in a language class, how it doesn't have to be all L1, the target language, sorry, and how we can get students to use that translation more constructively. I believe that sometimes students need to see how this structure relates to what they have done in their own education, in their own examinations, for instance. But the problem that I most often find is that many cultures, many education cultures, don't require or don't prioritize more than this lower order thinking skills, partly because they don't have time, partly because of the examination system, that it's often easier to test these lower order thinking skills than it is to test the higher order ones. And so it might be that students have very little experience of what they of what is required of them. Thanks very much, Sean, for the link. Appreciate that support there. So yeah, just looking at the chat that people have. Raja, I'm going to have to come back to that because it's quite a long point that you're making there, right? So I'm just going to move on to show you the next level, right? So when we're talking about comprehension, what we're discussing, or what we're indicating, is that students show their understanding, right? And so at the lower level, at the individual level of activities, we've got things that students can do just to look at the information that they've listed and think of examples, or think of how they would explain this, right? Then we've got the kinds of activities that they might do in pairs, where they might ask about the examples or ask about the points that they've raised, and then we might ask them to categorize, to group. Now, it's interesting because I use this method myself in my classes to devise activities, to think about how I'm pushing students. And today I was doing this with a group of teachers, and when I asked them to classify, it was something that they understood how to do, but it wasn't necessarily something that they recognized was useful to do until I started talking to them about how it might be useful to classify ideas so that they can then construct paragraphs about this, or so that they can then talk on a topic with examples, with explanation, and then move on to another topic. But very often, one of the problems that I found in students speaking and their writing, and speaking does affect the way that students write, is that they can talk about points individually, but they can't necessarily group those points into a category or a topic that that they can then focus on as the main point that they're making, and then group ideas into that topic, right? So what I would say is that you might find with certain groups that some of these activities are more challenging than others, and that you have to work on those and you have to emphasize those, as I did today. It was a surprise to me that when I asked people to classify them, it wasn't something that they automatically did. It wasn't something that they had done very much before, and so I had to work on that and explain it. But I found it was a very useful activity for them to do in order to then be able to explain to other students what they were talking about, right? So this is the second level, the showing understanding. And what we can do then is we can take activities from this level and we can add them to this first level of knowledge, right? So again, with holidays, we might ask the students to list the places they visited, define a good holiday, but then to illustrate the qualities of a good holiday, right? So we might say a good holiday is one that's near near water. For example, if you go to Cornwall, it has a very long coastline, and so there are a few places in Cornwall that are more than an hour away from the beach or from the sea by car, right? Because of the long coastline, it has a number of towns, a number of cities that are on the coast and that are easily, where the sea is easily accessible, right? So if you want to go on holiday in a place that's near the coast, pick somewhere that has a long coastline. Now you might say, well, that's a very high level of language, right? But you might simply say something like a good holiday is one near the water, for example, by the sea, or on a lake, or by the river. Right? They're using prepositions, they're illustrating it with examples, and they could illustrate it with examples from their own experience. Right? Then we might ask students to ask each other about these qualities, right? Or ask for illustrations, and they might compare their experiences and rephrase it. Right? All this, I would emphasize, is at the level of knowledge and comprehension. We're not asking students to move beyond that in terms of their thinking. We're doing a lot of language building with relatively low level thinking skills. Right? So that's another point that I would make to you, is that very often teachers say to me, well, it's difficult to do this in English because the students haven't developed their thinking skills in their own language. The education system doesn't necessarily develop these skills in their first language, or students don't develop these skills in their first language. And so what I would say to you is that there's a lot that can be done in terms of language within these levels and across these levels, right? So the third lower order thinking skill, as defined initially by Bloom, is that of application, right? And we have some verbs that we could use in relation to this that students could do by themselves, many more that they could do in pairs or in groups, and many of these are quite complex linguistically, but they're still relatively easy in terms of thinking, right? It is not that demanding to ask somebody to plan something. It's not that demanding in terms of functions to say what your plan is. The first step would be to, or the first step is, right? After that, we would do this, right? In interviewing people, if you have a low-level group of students, it's not even necessary that they have to have control of all the the structures of questions. You know, it might be acceptable that they just invert, as students very often do. They invert the subject and the verb, right? So instead of saying, "Do you like ice cream?" right, or coming back to the holidays, "Do you like holiday near the water?" they say, "You like holiday near the water." And very often, this is what I get in language classes, is especially at low levels, is the tilt of the head that indicates that they're making a question. Yeah. And so, again, to come back to what I was saying here, the teacher can get a lot of language work out of relatively low-level thinking skills, right? To come back to, I'm just going back through the chat box. People are asking about how I use these, how I use this in class. So what I would typically do in a class is that either I would have these slides, these kinds of slides, printed out and put them around the wall to indicate the kind of activities that they can do at each level. Or, as I did this afternoon, I would print the slides out and hand them out to students along with a bank of phrases that they could use for each of these kinds of tasks, right? So I make this a teaching resource that we come back to again and again and again throughout my classes, right? So, for instance, if you're interested, then I can provide you with a resource bank of phrases that you can use for each one of these kinds of verbs, right? So as we saw earlier, just to skip back to here, right? We have different kinds of language that we can use for each one of these kinds of verbs, right? And my suggestion is that if we have this kind of language, right, then students can more easily get into the tasks. And if we have these kinds of things around the class, it's part of what the students are doing. If, as some teachers don't, if you don't have your own room, then what I would recommend is making something that the students can put into perhaps the front of their course book, or that they can put into the front of their workbooks. Right? As Sean will tell you, Oxford will be providing this as a handout, and if you want to get in touch with me, then I'm more than happy to provide you with whatever kinds of resources might help. I have phrase banks. I have things that you can use. Okay, so I'll put my email address up at the end again. So just to show how this works again, right? So at the lowest level, we have the students defining and illustrating these qualities, right? Then what we might do is ask them to interview each other, plan a good holiday, and then teach others about what a good holiday might be for them, right? So they are not just explaining, but they're using the information that they have gathered and the information that they've thought about to tell or to teach other people about these aspects of it, right? So what we're trying to do is to build these activities into more complex tasks, right? So we take a verb from the lowest level, where we've got students focusing on knowledge, and we're adding it to another verb that we're using where the students are explaining, and then we're building that into using that information in particular ways. Right? Now, one of the points that's been made here by some of the people in the chat box is that students are struggling with the basic language. Right? I'm not arguing with people about that. I'm fully aware that sometimes students have limited amounts of language that they can control. But what I'm saying is that sometimes communication is about using the limited amount of language that you have to do quite complex tasks, right? And that there is a place for working with students on accuracy and control of grammar and vocabulary. And I would also suggest that there's a place for helping students to develop communicative abilities to do communication that is higher order with the limited language that they have, right? And I would suggest that that can be done as long as we structure it quite carefully. And if we decide that the students need to work at lower levels of thinking, we can do that. But as I emphasized earlier, we can do that by using a number of different kinds of activities that focus on these lower level language skills and these lower level thinking skills that are related to language. Okay? All right, so this is your opportunity to raise issues that you've had. So Atef, I'm probably not saying that in the correct way, but one of the issues that has been raised is that students sometimes have difficulty in doing this, or teachers have difficulty doing this because of students' language control. Okay? All right, so I'm just asking people how much problem they would have doing this. And okay, so at the moment we've got people saying that it would depend. Many people are saying it would depend. If you're saying it depends, number 3, right? And so Johan has indicated that it's number 3 because it would depend on the students. I'm presuming that when he says it depends on the students, it would be on the students' language level, right? Okay, so we've got another example here that Elizabeth is saying it depends on how focused the curriculum is on using the textbooks. Okay, so okay, the level of the students, we're teaching mixed ability classes. I agree that we're teaching mixed abilities, but that's one of the points that I'm making for this kind of system, right? So the point that I'm making is if we have limited time, if we have limited language skills, right, then what we need to have is a very clear system of developing the communication that students do with those language skills, right? And one of the points that I would make is that I regularly encounter students whose grammar is fantastic, whose vocabulary is extensive, but who struggle to communicate because they have never been taught that language is for communication and that language communication builds from one function to another function to another function, right? So that they have the tools, they have the language and the vocabulary, the grammar and the vocabulary tools, but they're not using it because, I would argue, because the teacher has not structured that language development and that vocabulary development into a communicative framework, right? And so what I'm proposing is that within the Common European Framework of topics and vocabulary and of grammar, we can situate that grammar, vocabulary topic development within a framework that encourages or that allows opportunities for communication, right? And that we can do that by simply choosing carefully the kinds of tasks that we ask students to do and the kinds of language that we ask them to use, right? Now, what I have found in my own teaching is that I come back to this framework again and again when I am short on time for thinking about what activities am I going to do in a class. Because once I have this set of activities or verbs at each level, it then becomes relatively simple for me to think, okay, so on this topic, the students are maybe not that aware of what the topic is. They've not done that much thinking before about it. They're not maybe ready to discuss very much without some lower order tasks that get them reflecting, that get them developing the content to be able to discuss. So what I would do in that context, in that situation, is that I would ask them to do more of these knowledge-based tasks before I indicate that they should go on to do the comprehension and the application tasks, right? And so that then helps me to structure the task in a principled, systematic way that students can see and can recognize is helping them to develop both their communication skills and their critical thinking skills, right? So, what I'm saying is that I strongly believe that if you are short on time, if you are struggling with different levels of students, mixed ability classes, that one of the fundamental things that you need to try and do is to situate your teaching in a framework. Right? Now, Elizabeth, I think, was talking earlier about problems that you have when you have to stick to a course book or when you have to stick to an examination system. And I recognize that is sometimes an issue because you're asked to do page 4, page 5 of the course book or to cover certain topics, right? But what I would emphasize is that if you are considering what you're doing in terms of this framework, then what you are helping students to do is to develop skills and develop language skills that are applicable to many examination contexts and many examination systems, right? So that you are approaching the development of those skills in a way that reflects what they're going to be required to do in their examination, right? So to come to Katerina's question, right? She's asking if we give students the freedom to choose, right? And what I would say is that the teacher needs to establish how much freedom they can give the student and how much they have to dictate, right? It might be that in the early stages of using this kind of framework, you have to dictate more to the students which kind of tasks they're doing. As they are progressing through and as they are more aware of how the framework works and the kinds of language, then you would hopefully be able to give the students more freedom to control what they have, more control over what they choose, what they look at, right? Okay, so what I'm focusing on here in many ways is giving students the ability to change the direction of what they're doing, to change the focus of what they're doing, to encourage more communication and more functional communication, so that it has a purpose, it has a rationale, right? That it's doing something specific rather than just talking, right? That there is a purpose to it. And the other point that I would strongly make is that putting communication within this kind of framework allows or encourages students to see communication in a different way and to see different things about communication, right? That when I talk to students very often about Bloom's taxonomy, about the different levels of communication, the different levels of demands of the task, right? Very often a light bulb goes on in their head, and they are like, oh, I suddenly understand what is required of me, what is being asked of me. It could be in examinations that they have to do for entry to certain courses. So for instance, in the UK very often they have to do an IELTS examination, and students might not understand why they're getting a lower mark, because they think, well, I'm answering the question, I'm responding to what the examiner is asking, and when I listen back to what they are saying, or when I talk to them about what they are saying, what they have said, what I find out is that they are communicating, but they're communicating in a very limited kind of way. They're not using the full range of functions, right? And so what I'm encouraging them to do is to approach it from a functional standpoint, right? So to give you an example in terms of IELTS, if an IELTS or a Cambridge examiner indicates to a student, FCE, for example, and says to a student, could you tell me about your holidays that you like taking, or sports that you like doing, right? It's much better if a student can present those sports in groups with examples and evaluation than if they just list them one after another and say, well, I like tennis and I also do football and sometimes I do basketball. That might be acceptable, but if they say, well, I do some sports that are outside and some sports that take place inside, but I prefer those that are outside, like football and basketball, because I prefer being out in nature and I prefer the physical difficulty that the wind and the rain presents, for example. Right? Now you might say that represents a higher level of language skills, but what I would argue is that it often reflects students using the limited language that they have in order to do higher order communication or higher order thinking. Okay, so we've got about 4 or 5 minutes before Sean is going to make sure that I pause for questions, and he's got I think he's kept track of some questions that I might have missed. So in terms of the analysis, here are some of the verbs that I would highlight for students going on to communicate more analytically, right? And so here is an example of how we might add analysis to to knowledge, comprehension, application. We would then add analysis by, for instance, asking students to survey what other people have put, to analyze the responses, and then maybe to research alternatives or research the possibilities in terms of these holidays, right? Or you might ask them just simply to survey and analyze, question and look at the responses, right? In terms of the solutions for encouraging communication at synthesis level, right? We have these verbs that look at combining information or using the information or the points that you have in a more in a way that builds on them, right? So we are combining information that we have with information that others have proposed. We are changing or revising what we have put in order to reflect what others have said, right? So for example, one of the activities that I did today with the students that I had was I asked them to create a poster reflecting on some observations that they'd done, highlighting the key points, the key areas. They wrote it down on the poster, and then I simply asked them to stand up, go around the posters without talking to anybody, look at those posters, think about what they saw in those posters that they didn't see in their own, go back to those posters and make changes, make revisions to their own posters that reflected what they had learned from other people's posters, and then discuss those changes that they'd made with, say, another person to indicate why they'd made the changes, what changes they'd made, what was good, what was not so good, right? So there, again, you're getting them to think about these things, prepare it before they're using the language, before they're actually doing. So the task is the basis for the language. The task is functional, and then they're using that function to prompt the language, and in many cases, that language to structure the communication that they're doing through the use of functional phrases, through the use of functional language. Okay, so if we're incorporating synthesis into the task that we're doing, then we might add a revision or a proposal stage to these tasks. Right? As I said, with the poster that we devised, we then revised it and made proposals from that revision. Right? Explained what we'd done, why we'd made the changes, and what would come from this. Okay? Conscious of time, moving on to the final stage, the evaluation, which is very often the thing that students struggle with most, but is often rewarded most highly, especially in academic contexts, certainly in the UK. In the UK, we're very, very conscious of the need to evaluate sources, the need to evaluate the information that you're getting, and to prioritize this in the work that you're doing. Yeah. So here are verbs that we might ask students to do in terms of tasks, right? And then here is how we might incorporate this into knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and then finally getting them to evaluate the product, evaluate the work that other people have put. Okay, so just to wrap up, final minute before questions, before points that I need to look at. What I'm trying to do in this framework is to provide students with a system and teachers with a system that will allow students to relax in terms of what is required of them, because they know what the demands are. They can perhaps alter the demands by altering the kinds of tasks that they're doing, but it's very clear how they are developing, right? Where they are going, what they're aiming for, and how they're going to get there. what I would emphasize is that this framework is designed to respond to the different needs of different students, different needs in terms of language, in terms of skills, in terms of personality and motivation, right? And I would also say in terms of time that teachers have, it's supposed to provide students with a clear picture of how they're progressing, where they're going. It's also to situate choice in a wider system, right? So that you can choose, but you can choose from within a system, not just choosing anything, but choosing for a particular reason, choosing for a particular purpose, right? It's trying to give the teacher the ability to change direction if they need to with students, but to do it relatively quickly because they have a clear idea of what the options are. And it's getting students to be able to see language and to see communication from a different point of view, to see that communication is functional, that communication reflects thinking, and that communication reflects, most of all, critical thinking in its different stages, in the way that it builds up from one stage to another, bringing all those different verbs, those different activities together. Okay, so just reading through some of the comments that people have made just most recently, what I would emphasize, Gulnara was saying earlier, is that if you can change the direction that students are going in, if you can change their approach to what they see as the purpose of language, then you can change their motivation, and I would strongly support that. But I'm conscious that I've lost track a bit of
there are quite a few questions, Kevin.
So the chat. Yeah. So Sean, did you have questions?
Yeah, starting with the nearest ones, I guess, is basically how do you assess such tasks that you give? I think Katerina asked that. So how do you assess the speaking tasks or evaluate them?
Well, okay, you can do it in two ways. You can do it as devising a product that students have to create, right? So a product that they might be expected to do a particular kind of task that involves the different kinds of speaking that you're expecting. And if you have that, then you might be setting up certain kinds of criteria. Are they expressing their comprehension? Are they expressing their use? And you would have criteria for those different things. So that's a product-based approach to assessment. But there's also something that's called a process folio, right? And what a process folio emphasizes is students doing activities or students doing tasks that shows them developing their abilities, right? So it's more common to do this in writing, but it certainly could be something that you do in speaking in terms of you show or you record them perhaps or you assess them at the different levels in terms of, say, assessing them on their ability to express their knowledge in different ways, their ability to express their comprehension in different ways. And you are then building a folio or a portfolio of what the students have demonstrated they can do at those different levels. So can they give examples? Can they explain in different ways, right? So it's coming back almost to the CEFR can-do statements, but it's looking at those can-do statements in terms of the framework that we've proposed. Okay. So
this kind of fits in with something, this is actually from very early on when you were talking about translation, but it kind of fits in there. Maya asked, she said, but the problem is, or one of the problems is, that you as a teacher have structures that you want to teach, but the students have picked up language and structures from different things, places like movies and the internet and stuff like that. So how do you balance that with the framework?
What I would very often do in that context is that I would give the students a task, first of all, to do. So for instance, a task like explain what a good holiday is. And then I might listen to the kinds of language that they are using naturally to define something. And if I can, I would ask them, or I would try to record those phrases that they're using. Either when I'm listening, I would put them on the board, or get them to write it out so that they are indicating what phrases they're using. And then I would try to go through and highlight, this is a phrase that you've used. Here's a phrase that might be more common, or a phrase that might be more formal, or a phrase that might be more acceptable in different situations, right? But the fact that they have actually remembered a phrase that has a particular function, or that they believe is suitable for that function, I would say is a huge bonus, is a huge positive point, because if they're thinking in terms of those kinds of phrases, I think you're on your way there. That if they are picking up those kinds of phrases, then I would use that to build other kinds of functional language, and to raise their awareness of, you are using this. It's a phrase, but it's only one phrase of a number, and you might have other phrases that are more acceptable to certain people, or more acceptable in certain contexts, and raising their awareness of that.
Thank you. I think it was Katarzyna, but I can't remember. There was a question. Well, so with evaluation and so on, how do you deal with students' fear because they know they're going to be making mistakes during speaking and getting evaluated?
Okay. Well, again, coming back to this idea of how are you assessing this, right? If you're assessing it as a product, then very often, the students are right in a way to be fearful of assessment, because they get one chance. They're assessed on a particular day, at a particular time, in a certain task, and they might not perform that well. If, however, you are assessing this as a process, that you're asking them to be able to show their ability to do different kinds of tasks at different times, maybe in combination, maybe in isolation, so can-do statements. And if they're building up that process approach, then I think it's more, it reduces the fear. Now, it might be that the two of these things go together, that you have a process approach which leads to a product. But I would say that process approach, that continuing or formative assessment, is an important part of developing communication, because communication is developmental and is almost always a process rather than a product. You might have certain products, like a presentation that you give, that is just a thing that you do, right? But it's more common, as in this webinar, where the product that you give is part of a process of communication, right? And so although I'm delivering this presentation, I'm doing it interactively, and I'm trying to respond to people's questions, and I'm trying to listen to what they're saying and acknowledge that there are certain points, certain problems, but offer solutions, offer responses. That's a process. And if communication is a process, then I think we have to reflect it in the assessment. And if we're not doing it, that's potentially why students are fearful. Now, it might be that Katarzyna would say we can't include the process in the final mark, but maybe what we can do is to build that process into the final product, so that students can see that they are doing things, that they can do things. And we're producing maybe a tick list to say, you have shown that you can do this. You have shown, so that when they get to the product, we can say to them, look, don't worry so much. You have shown here that you could do this, that you could explain yourself. You've shown here that you could define things. You've shown here that you could analyze things. You've shown that you can do all of this. Now it's just time to put it all together, right? Okay.
Fair enough. Throughout your talk, people were talking about the level B1. It sort of came up first in translation. So Adriana, back at the discussion on translation, said, well, at B1 level, they shouldn't really be translating, should they? But I'll also add the question, I think it was from Atef, who said, does your framework work only from B1 up, or can it be used lower? So there were two questions that kind of hinge on the B1 level.
Sure. No, so if I go back to the slide that I was using here, I explicitly said, and I took it from here, the A1 level, the holidays, right? So the examples that I gave were from the topics and the vocabulary that Equals and CEFR refers to as part of A1 and A2, right? So they say that at A1 and A2, holidays are suitable topics, and suitable, when it says here plus education, it means all of these topics are applicable to A2 with the addition of education. So my strong argument would be that in actual fact, this framework needs to be introduced, or this kind of approach to language and to language learning needs to be introduced as early as possible. And that I would say that if we can get students to understand that language is functional, that language serves a communicative purpose, and that's its in large part, that's its essence. That we are doing things with the language. We have particular purposes that we want. We want to define something. We want to list it. We want to explain it with illustrations. That we can do that at lower levels of language with these kinds of topics, with this kind of vocabulary, with the grammar that is provided in the CEFR or the Equals framework of core competencies, right? Which again, if people want to get in touch with me, then I can provide links to that if they wish.
Okay, probably time for two more quick questions. Well, I don't know if it's a quick, it's a quick question. I don't know if it's a quick answer. So the two questions I asked a little bit was how do you? They were talking. There was a discussion about the number of students in the class. So the question that leads from that is how do you do this with classes of 28?
But this was one of the reasons that I first started developing this kind of framework for teaching or for speaking, is because I was encountering environments where teachers were saying, but I've got a class of 60, I've got a class of 40. How do I do this? And so what I'm saying is that if you've got a framework, if you've got a clear list of the kinds of verbs or the kinds of activities that students are expected to do, and you keep coming back to this, and students know exactly what is expected of them in order to show, for instance, that they can show their comprehension, then it's a lot easier to work with larger classes. Right? I would argue, once the framework is clear, it's easier to work with those larger classes because everybody has a shared sense of what they are doing, how they are doing it, what they are aiming at, and what their purpose is. Right? So I often am teaching classes of 25, classes of 30, bigger. And I am constantly using this kind of framework because it's the only way that I find to keep students on track and to keep everybody with a shared sense of where we are going, what we are doing, why we are doing it.
It's interesting you say you're constantly using the framework, because I think the last question, which is asked by, again, Katerina, is how often do you actually use the framework in your lessons?
I use it all the time. I use Bloom's taxonomy. This taxonomy is a fundamental part of everything I do because what I'm trying to do is to get students and teachers to reflect and to think about the higher levels of what they're doing in terms of thinking, reflecting, combining information, because I fundamentally think that is what is going to be required of teachers and of students in the future, and increasingly is becoming more and more important. And I don't just want to be doing that in an abstract way. I want to be able to do that in a way that says to teachers, says to students, this is an activity that we're doing and it fits into this framework in this way. Right? It's not just an activity in isolation, it's an activity that's part of the framework. If we do this, we can then use this information to do something else, and then use that information to do something else, which is often higher level. So in my teaching practice nowadays, the Bloom's taxonomy and the kinds of verbs and activities that go with it is a fundamental part of everything that I do.
I realise it is 5 o'clock, but there is one more question because I did miss it, and Atef just reminded me about it. So Atef's question was about materials. Are there course books, of apply this framework that you would recommend? And are there any books in particular that you would recommend about teaching communication?
It's an interesting question and a difficult one to ask, because there are course books that incorporate critical thinking into the teaching of language. So because critical thinking is becoming a bigger thing, many course books are now incorporating it. My argument would be that they're not incorporating it in a very systematic way, or a way that's very easy for teachers to develop. So there are communicative activities books, but they tend to have activities that are focusing on one aspect of communication or one kind of communication, rather than activities that are combining different kinds of activities in order to build to a higher purpose. So what I would encourage people to do is, if they have communicative activities course books, of which there are many on the market, many, you can simply type in communicative activities in academic English for academic purposes, and people can get in touch with me, and I can make recommendations of things for different contexts. But to use it, to think about it within a wider framework, think about, what is this activity asking my students to do, and at what level? Is it knowledge? Is it comprehension? Is it incorporating different levels? What do I need to do before it so that students have knowledge? What do I need to do after it in order to get students to be developing skills? I've just put up my email address. If people want to get in touch with me for those kinds of recommendations of particular course books for particular contexts, that would be the best way to do it, is email me, tell me what your context is, tell me what kinds of students you're teaching, and I can try and make a recommendation for what kinds of materials would be useful for that context.
Thanks for answering the questions, Tony. I'll leave it with you for a minute to wrap up, and then I'll take over again. Okay,
so just thanks to everybody. I'm very happy for anybody to get in touch with me. I really enjoyed all the comments that people have been making in the chat. I'm sorry if I haven't been able to keep up with them, but sometimes it's a little difficult to scroll through them and then to comment on them. So thanks very much to Sean for doing such an excellent job of keeping track of the questions, and thanks to you for thanking Sean.